Social interests. Commentators have understood in a variety of ways Hume's reference to the social utility of female chastity. The most obvious would seem to be in terms of the expenses incurred by the male in the rearing of children, and the male need to know that his property is being passed on to his biological offspring. Anne Levy, in Under Constraint, Chastity and Modesty in Hume, offers a more sophisticated account showing how the chastity of women is more clearly one of general social utility, not just for the direct needs of the putative father. Without the certainty of paternity, children may be abandoned, and this will lead to the disruption of normal social institutions, including presumably such things as the education of children into appropriate roles and the inheritance of property. Obviously, it is hard to deny the truth of these commentators' claims, but ultimately these claims are unsatisfactory in the completeness of their explanation. Surely, in the case of the first set of commentators, the double standard of chastity is both a remarkably inefficient and, for women, cruel way to ensure that society is not saddled with the financial support of unwanted children. On Levy's account, the chastity of women does appear to be more logical. She sees men as living in a situation like the prisoner's dilemma. Individual men have no direct interest in being chaste themselves, but a direct interest in the chastity of other men. Unfortunately, there are no external penalties for the unchaste male. Women, however, run risks if they are unchaste. They may lose their status as wives and the paternity of their children. Levy concludes that given the appropriate background structures, chastity and modesty in women is the solution to a prisoner's dilemma for men. However, this use of women to solve the dilemma of men still seems cruel. Repressing one half of human society, women are not only to be chaste, but their behavior is further constrained by the social rules of modesty, in order to preserve the interests of the other half is extreme. It is hard to reconcile the Hume who would support, tacitly or explicitly, this use of women with the Hume who has been seen as a friend to women by some commentators. Further economic and psychological considerations may initially appear to offer additional support to the type of interpretation of the social utility of female chastity given above. An example of this first type of consideration would be a recognition that if men did not support their children, few women would be in a position to do so. An example of the second would be the male uncertainties and anxieties stemming from the asymmetry of knowledge about parentage of children. But these additional considerations still leave it unclear as to what exactly is the social utility of female chastity. I believe we should be careful not to focus too closely on the issue of child rearing at the expense of neglecting an examination of the issue of inheritance, which is, after all, part of Hume's claim about female chastity. In other words, we should not place the issue of social utility only within the framework of male-female relations. Instead, we should consider the way that other important social categories, specifically class, were at play in the 18th century and thus in Hume's work. In fact, it seems rather unlikely that a wife passing off her lover's child as her husband's would have been a common occurrence. Although birth control was typically used as a prevention against disease, it was available, and abortificants were advertised in newspapers. Midwives, if paid handsomely enough, would deliver and dispose of babies produced by adulterous liaisons among the aristocracy. Moreover, as was stated earlier, there do seem to have been cases where a husband was content to pay for his wife's illegitimate children to be raised elsewhere. By contrast, the need for certainty so that property was secure and could be transferred to the next generation would have been uppermost in the minds of many of Hume's contemporaries. Class interests and chastity. It is important to notice the emphasis on property during this period. The 18th century was an unstable time for property owners, whether the property was long established or newly acquired. For the latter, according to Paul Langford in A Polite and Commercial People, this was mainly due to the pace of economic expansion during this period and its unstable nature, something which affected even landed society. The 18th century class system was complex and to an extent fluid. The classes can be loosely divided into three levels: elite, middling, and laboring. It would have been the middling class, a group of the professional and merchant classes, who would have had strong particular concerns about the issues of property because of the economic uncertainties of their lives. Their contemporaries referred to this group as the middle or middling sort. The existence of a distinct and definable middle class did not come into place until the 19th century. It is for this reason that I use the looser term middling class, which is a better reflection of the innumerable gradations of income and snobbery on which contemporary analysts frequently commented. Langford has argued that economic instability is correlated to a greater emphasis on marriage as a commercial transaction. Given this, unmarried women needed to remain chaste so that they could remain competitive. A successful marriage could benefit the bride's entire family, socially as well as financially. Married women, on the other hand, needed to remain faithful so that the acquired property could be kept within the family and transmitted to the next generation. Furthermore, unlike the aristocracy, which was at least established as a class, the middling classes needed to consolidate both their class status and their property in an attempt to climb the social ladder. Indeed, the 18th century has been characterized as one of relentless social climbing. It is within this class that the sexual double standard would have been more rigidly enforced. Indeed, Bridget Hills sees the role female chastity played in the 18th century as having its origins in the economic and social ideals of the middling class. 18th century males' concerns about the parentage of their children would have been primarily concerns about heirs and transmission of property, not concerns about whether they were raising someone else's child. Class status and its security was not something that could be achieved by individual self-made man alone. It was achieved through the family unit and thus through female chastity. However, class status was not just about property. The 18th century emphasis on reputation or honor provided an important explanation for the needs of the middling classes for female chastity. For the aristocracy, good breeding would also have secured the reputation, and it would appear that few dents need not have damaged a female aristocrat's reputation irrevocably. For the middling classes, on the other hand, reputation was needed to secure class status as well as to contribute to the economic security of the business or profession. Indeed, it also appears that the reputation of the wife could even affect the reputation or honor of the husband, as an unfaithful wife could mean that you were thought unqualified for public office. In this way, then, the social interests that make female chastity a virtue are not simply those of husbands, or of individual women, or of a society not wanting to provide for abandoned children. These interests are also social interests of class development and preservation. Indeed, in his Enquiry Concerning the Principles of Morals, Hume states that one of the ills that befall the unchaste woman is that she loses her rank. This interconnection of class interests with female chastity allows us to see more clearly what Hume means in the following passage from An Inquiry Concerning the Principles of Morals. He says that the virtues of honesty, fidelity, truth are praised for their immediate tendency to promote the interests of society, but after those virtues are once established upon this foundation, they are also considered as advantageous to the person himself, and as the source of that trust and confidence which can alone give a man any consideration in life. One becomes contemptible, no less than odious, when he forgets the duty, which in this particular he owes to himself as well as to society. Perhaps this consideration is one chief source of the high blame which is thrown on any instance of failure among women in point of chastity. These virtues not only promote the interests of society, but they are beneficial to their individual possessor. But the benefit to the individual of keeping one's word for a man is not simply about being trusted. Rather, this virtue gives him what Hume calls consideration in life. We need to understand this phrase in 18th century terms to mean social esteem or regard. Hume then states that perhaps this consideration is a major source of the blame thrown at unchaste women. If we take consideration here again in the 18th century terms, we can then see that female chastity is bound up with the social respect or status accorded to you by others. In this way, female chastity could serve class, family, and individual interests for the middling classes. This interconnection of class interests with female chastity also allows us to understand how Hume would need to emphasize consistency within an individual's life rather than consistency within a population. Seen within a class context, ungentlemanly or unladylike behavior in an individual could affect the perceived virtues of a whole class, especially those of a class that aspires for social recognition and establishment of status. Whereas the elite classes could be distinguished by family or rank within that class, and thus the loss of reputation of one family need not affect others. The middling classes were only beginning to establish groupings within these classes, and thus loss of reputation was more widespread. Indeed, both modern historians and 18th century writers have noted that the desire for gentility was the glue that connected the otherwise disparate sectors of the middling classes. What is interesting, and will be shown later on, is that Hume's own account of the principle of sympathy can be used to provide an account of how this could be achieved. It can be explained within the Humean philosophical worldview. Thus, understood as a virtue related to property and class interests, chastity is not so different from other artificial virtues, after all, in its promotion of general good. Moreover, understood as a virtue related to property, chastity now fits well into Hume's schema of the artificial virtues. 18th century concerns about the vulnerability and stability of possession would appear to lie at the heart of Hume's discussion of the artificial virtues. However, the concern about property of the middling class, its connection to class status, can also be seen to be reflected in Hume's account of the passions. The artificial virtue of chastity, because of the way it is intertwined with property and social status, has some kind of relation, albeit an indirect one, to the passions. It is worth exploring this briefly in order to show that the notions of class, social standing, and property at play in the artificial virtues are not an anomaly. They would have been part of the practice of the world that Hume would have observed.